Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming to the last talk of this incredible event. I'd like to thank Bloomberg and everyone behind the scenes who make such invitations possible. So my talk, A equals YAE, loosely follows another famous equation, E equals MC squared, which I must confess I still don't understand. But in this case, A equals Africa and E equals environment, the gravity around which the modern world revolves, and the resources upon which it depends. A decade ago, it might have been possible to talk about the built environment only, but our understanding of the relationships between the so-called natural world, natural environments, untouched by human hands, and built environments, regulated, structured, and engineered, is more nuanced. Nature is neither pristine nor untouched, and in many parts of the world, especially Africa, cities are overwhelmingly unplanned. And indeed, our relationship between built and natural is increasingly toxic. One man's ease is clearly another's hardship. But to return to Einstein for a second, the more massive an object, the more it warps the space around it. And the same is true of Africa. If I had $1 for every time a foreigner, usually European, apologies to the Europeans, has said to me, "Oh, I love Africa," I could have retired 30 years ago. I still have no idea what the statement means, and neither, I suspect, do the people who say it. But whatever they imagine, I don't think it's contemporary urban Africa that they're referring to. We are simultaneously the world's richest and poorest continent. Most of our wealth is raw material wealth, minerals, hydrocarbons, crops, reservoirs of capital that lie outside cities, below the surface of the earth in mines or industrial-scale plantations. But cities are the engines of growth and human capital development. We know this, and it's why we're gathered here today. Yet often African cities are amongst the most desperate places on the planet. Seychelles is the only African country that falls into the UN's Human Development High Index. And herein lies one of the biggest contradictions and one of the most intractable problems of this century and the next. Youth and aspiration, the Y and the A in the equation. As the world's youngest and fastest urbanizing continent, Africa straddles a fine and continuously shifting line between enormous energy and optimism on one side and despair on the other. What should be a dynamic, enabling combination is fraught. And education is both the bedrock and the battleground on which the future is being fought. Statistics are always tricky. They can be manipulated to shape almost any argument. But here are a few that I think are worth bearing in mind. Africa's population stands at about 1.3 billion. But spending on education across Africa has barely changed in 20 years, still at approximately 4% of GDP, but this is not spread evenly across the continent. And let me focus for a second on architecture, my discipline. 70% of African schools of architecture are located in North and South Africa, leaving almost 1 billion people served by 30 schools. Now, by comparison, the UK, with a population of 66 million, has 70 schools of architecture. Francophone West Africa, with a population of almost 300 million, has only one accredited school. It's generally accepted that the fastest-growing cities in the world over the next quarter century are in Africa, and with the exception of Tokyo, the largest cities in the world will all be in the global south. These two factors, geography and speed, will determine the state of the world's cities in the coming decades, touching everything from migration to municipal elections. I first visited Mexico City in 2015, part of a university delegation from South Africa. And it was an eye-opening visit on many levels. There was enough overlap in terms of challenges and familiar contexts, but by far the greatest difference that I saw was in the sense of ownership over both ideas and the means of producing ideas, education, in other words. Over the past decade, my sense is of one continent forging ahead, challenges notwithstanding, and the other, my continent, falling further and further behind, lacking the educational infrastructure, political will, and crucially, the confidence to do anything about it. If you look closely at this slide, it's likely you'll recognize many of the faces. Taken from a variety of places, these are 28 of the best-known African architects and academics working in Africa today. What's unusual, perhaps, is that every single one studied overseas, UK, US, China, Switzerland, France, Australia, anywhere but at home. And for many African students, the underlying assumption that the only way to make an impact in your field is to leave your country is distressing. So on the world's youngest and fastest urbanizing continent, we're failing to adequately educate and equip nearly half of our population to deal with the challenges that are coming their way. But we're also depriving the rest of the world of the talent, imagination, and ambition of this dynamic, creative, and fearless human resource that could, under the right circumstances, transform the way we think about architecture and our built and natural environments. I'm going to show a very short video from the artist-architect Olalekan Jefus, who is Nigerian-born, Brooklyn-based, and who won the Silver Lion for Promising Young Participant at last year's Venice Biennale. Tech.
I was very inspired by the kind of creative process that an architect undergoes when they're given a particular project. And that's exactly the kind of process that I do when producing my speculative artwork. The artwork is titled The African Conservation Effort / All Africa Proto-Ports. And what it is an elaborate eco-fiction that starts from a kind of alternate timeline, sort of inflection point in 1972, which is roughly 10 years after a lot of African countries gained independence from colonial rule. And what it does is it imagines that there was a continent-wide effort to dispel the colonial influence, colonial rule, but also to consolidate into creating a kind of massive, continent-wide environmental movement. But then from there, what occurred in the intervening years is that this massive conservation effort led to discoveries of alternate fuel, alternate resources, power, conservation, and developments of several hyper-travel advancements, notably suborbital travel and a kind of magnetic levitation tube loop, right? So the idea was that these two advancements would connect not only the continents of Africa, the countries within, but also through suborbital travel, connect the countries of the diaspora.
So his work is an amazing example of the kind of critical and ethical creativity that so many young African and diasporan practitioners exhibit. And the jury singled out his work for exploring a world-building practice that expands public perspectives and imaginations, offering visions of a decolonized and decarbonized future. In the past decade, across the continent, we've seen students taking to the streets in one country after another. The root causes are the same: corruption, mismanagement, hardship, and occasionally ideology. And the quality of education rarely figures as a concern, which is a concern in itself. And for the most part, architects and built environment professionals remain silent. In 2021, I returned home to Ghana, where I'm from, to try and set up a small independent Institute of Architecture. And before you get too excited, these are only renders. I asked 2 firms to put together a comprehensive feasibility study, but the return on investment for an educational project isn't there, certainly not with our leaders, philanthropists, or investors. And therein lies the quandary. We have the vision, we have the talent, the ambition, and the aspiration, but we do not have the environment, the political, financial, cultural, or even social will to make the kinds of investments necessary to deal with the looming future, let alone change. And I'm going to end here with 2 quotes which perfectly encapsulate what most of us think, feel, and know. No sensible decision can be made any longer without taking into account not only the way the world is, but the world as it will be. And education is the best economic policy there is. With 26 seconds to spare, thank you.